Just because information successfully makes it to your memory doesn't mean that it will stay there forever, and we can forget things due to many reasons. I want you to know and be familiar with 4 reasons for forgetting. The first is something that we call an encoding failure. Well, you know, encoding is the process with which your brain makes sensory information usable. So an encoding failure is when we don't properly do that to begin with. If I were to ask you what the head's side of a penny looks like, think about that for a second. Don't cheat, don't look at a penny or the internet. But if you just try to think about what the head side of a penny looks like and draw it, you might actually be wrong. And you might say, well, why? Why is this so difficult? I've seen pennies my whole life, probably billions of them. Why don't you know what that is? Well, unless you're really into coins, you probably never just pulled out a penny and stared at it and said to yourself, huh, and encoded all that information in a usable way. If you're not attending to it, if it's just in the background, we don't encode it properly, so we forget it because we never properly encoded it to begin with. So that's an encoding failure. The next reason for forgetting is actually kind of split into 2 different ones, and I call these decay and disuse. They're actually the same thing, it just depends on which stage of memory we're talking about. So decay is when you don't use a memory and it leaves your short-term memory. So if you're trying to memorize a list of information and you keep it in there and then you stop trying to remember it and you hold on to some things but others just kind of go away, well, that's decay because it was in your short-term memory. Disuse is the same phenomenon, but this time it's with information in your long-term memory. I used to know my high school locker combination very well. I could just walk up to it, twist that dial, didn't have to think about it. But since it's been a long time since I've had to use it, that memory is gone. It's still there, but I have a hard time accessing that memory. So that would be due to disuse. It was in my long-term memory. I knew it very well, but I stopped using it, and so the idea is that it's in there somewhere, but the pathway to it has atrophied. We are not using that path anymore, so we have a tough time getting back to that memory. So that's decay and disuse. Same thing, just depends on which stage of memory we're talking about. The next 2 are very similar as well. This is a little bit confusing, so make sure you spend some time practicing with this. But proactive interference and retroactive interference are 2 terms that students will confuse quite a bit. And obviously they sound similar. But proactive interference is when you learned subject A, and then you learn subject B, and then you're trying to remember subject B, but that stuff you learned before it is causing the interference. Let me say that again. You learned one thing, you learned something else, and while trying to relearn that thing that you just learned, you have a hard time because of the interference that came before it. Retroactive interference is when you learn A, you learn B, and then you try to recall A, but now B gets in the way. That newer information interferes with the past. So again, your textbook will give you some examples of this. If you are studying English, and then you study Spanish, and then you are tested on Spanish, well, English can be proactive interference. If you study English, and then you study Spanish, and then you test on English, well, then Spanish becomes retroactive interference because it's interfering with the past. So again, that can be really tricky. The more you read that, the more you practice it, the more you listen, the easier understanding that difference can be. But make sure you know those reasons for forgetting: encoding failure, decay and disuse, proactive interference, and retroactive interference.